right, man. So we have an absolutely massive surge happening for Kamala Harris. Now, what we know is Kamala Harris is absolutely surging with women voters. Her numbers are really rebounding from what Biden was at in his polls. His polls are really slugging. Young voters, black voters, women voters, etc. And Kamala Harris is raised now. One poll had her, I think, plus 13 amongst women. I think Biden had about a plus 11 marker. We can look at those numbers later. But she's basically rebounding to the point of getting back to these numbers where you can see, Biden got 2020 55-44. I think 2020 numbers are kind of the benchmark here. If you get the 2020 numbers, you should be able to win. Hillary had a 15 margin with women. And so Kamala's at 13, but there's a lot still out there. And so likely she's going to get even more. Here we have something interesting. So this guy says, wow, we have a decent number of states with the recent registration file updates now. I ran the gender gaps among new registrants in the 2 weeks after Biden's withdrawal. Women have been registering to vote at a very high rate. This is eclipsing the post-Dobbs surge most places. So what we can see here is this little this graph here. So it says President Biden withdrew from the presidential race on July 21st. This graph details the gender gap and the share of new voter registrants in the 2-week period following 7/21 in both 2024 and the same. So from the top, you can see in the top what the poll reads. It says it talks about how this is the gap. So these percentages that you're seeing are the gap of the gender gap, right? So the blue one is post July 21st, 2024, and then the orange one is post July 21st, 2020. So you can see in Arkansas, you have 11.7% gender gap from women subtracted by men, right? W minus M is 11.7. After July 21st in 2020, it was 2.5%. In Kentucky, it was 11.9%. And then you have 3.7% in July 21st, 2020. And then we have like a really hard red state of Louisiana here. We have a massive one, so it's 26.4% compared to 6.7%. So one thing that's interesting that I know some people are theorizing, are there kind of women in red states who just kind of vote for whoever their husband votes for whatever reason it may be? Maybe they feel forced or those kinds of things. Is there kind of like this silent switch that's going to happen where you're going to have a surge of women who are going to break from their husbands and who they vote for and vote for Kamala Harris? That's an interesting question. What is going on here in Louisiana? Why is it 4 times? Why is this bar so absolutely massive, right? We see here in Maryland, it's 4.5 versus 2.7 here. 6.6 versus 0 in Michigan. This is huge in Michigan. Michigan looks like to be the kind of only swing state on this list. But the state Michigan up by 6.6 points, which is absolutely huge for Kamala Harris and women voters. 4.0 versus 2.1% in New York. 4.9 versus 0.1 in Ohio. Can this kind of thing make Ohio interesting? Because unfortunately, Ohio is no longer a swing state, but it's fine. Ohio sucks, and we replace them anyways. But Rhode Island, you have 5.1 to 3. Vermont, 7.6 to 5.5. 4.9 to 0.5 in Wyoming. So again, is there some kind of secret women vote who are going to be breaking away from, the shackles of who their husband is voting for in red states? Who knows? That would be something kind of interesting to see. But what's clear is we can see there's a massive bump going on in this registration. And it's pretty interesting. She's kind of getting closer to Biden numbers. Biden's numbers were slightly less than Hillary's numbers. But her surge is interesting because kind of compared to Hillary, Hillary always talked about her gender all the time. Kamala never says anything about her gender. And is that something that's kind of going to help her with women? Because right now where she's at, she's pretty close to the Biden, or she's actually better than Biden numbers because Biden here was plus 11. She's right now plus 13 according to one of the polls. So she's already close to Hillary's numbers here in 2016. So she's probably going to eclipse it because she's still got a lot of room for growth right now. I mean, if you look at the national numbers, she's still growing. She just hit a peak yesterday, and then we see that she hit a snag here and she actually broke through the plateau. She had hit a snag between the 12th and the 20th, where it's basically the same numbers over and over again. And then she breaks through on the 21st. So she's already proven that the honeymoon period is going to last longer than a lot of people thought. So she's in a position now where it's probably not going to end. It's probably not going to go away. A big thing about women voters, too, is they actually are registered to vote at higher numbers. And we also know that they actually are having higher turnouts. This is from Brookings Institute. They say women's turnout rates are higher, perhaps even more important than partisan preferences. Turnout rates, the share of eligible voters who vote, will help dictate women's influence in the coming election. Turnout rates for women have exceeded those for men in presidential elections dating back to 1980. Figure 4 depicts gender differences in turnout for presidential elections since 2000. And so we can see here that you have women outpacing men in every single election since 2000. So I don't know how the numbers work out in terms of specific swing states, but at least nationally, that would mean that it should be better to actually do better with women voters than male voters, um, because the turnout rates are higher. The registration numbers are also higher as well, and so in these gender differences, you have 14 over here, and then as the Democrat and Republican margin. So pretty interesting to see here. Pretty interesting to see here. If you see for the women versus men, so they obviously vote definitely very Democrat. This article saying Harris builds 13-point lead over Trump with women poll. Vice President Harris boasts a 13-point lead over former President Trump among women voters in a new poll, a notable edge at the major voting bloc that could be crucial for her in November. I also want to kind of say this also. She has to grow with these numbers. So a 13-point lead, she's getting hurt with male voters by a few points, I think. So what she's going to need to do is she has to stem this harder. And I think it'll be fine. I think the numbers are going to continue to grow. I think October is the worry time, not September. But wherever she's at in all of these groups now where she's surging, right, we're looking at margins and seeing how they're going up. She still has to go higher. She can't just stop here. She has to grow even more. So she needs, I think, it's at least Hillary numbers for sure. But it talks about how she has a lead in the poll. And what we can see here is we also have some interesting Gen Z numbers coming out. We know that Gen Z is heavily pulling towards Kamala. But we can see is it seems to be pretty women-driven. So it says the age gap between young men and women is wild. Gen Z's gender gap, though women are more likely than men to support Kamala Harris over Donald Trump in every age group, the gap is biggest among young voters. This is pretty crazy. So the gap being the largest isn't because men are specific. There's not really much of there's the relationship, I guess, correlation between males and age and support for Trump appears to be spurious because all three of these are the same except for 45 to 64. But you can see women are just pulling really, really heavily for Harris. So they're plus 40 for Harris, but men are only plus 12 or whatever this is. And this is the NYT Siena August 2024 battleground polls in Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. So these are the swing state polls here. And so you have women are just going crazy. And so the male ones isn't really something specifically to age brackets, but men 10 plus 10 for support for Trump is really, really sus. That's honestly straight up embarrassing. I don't know why that's even possible. Maybe there's I think there might be some reactionary thing. I kind of saw that as well, but there seemed to be kind of a lot of reactionary maybe stuff to a lot of the trans stuff or those kinds of social progress being made and things like that. So maybe that's what's going on. But young women super pro Harris. Again, I have no idea why. I'm really curious because his positions are basically the same. She doesn't have any strong history on abortion. There's nothing really interesting about her relating her to her being a woman. I'm not really sure what it is. So her surge is crazy, but her numbers aren't at Hillary's numbers yet. So they might just kind of be something in line with that. We don't know if it's because she's a woman or not. We're not sure. But we know that her numbers, the peak numbers that she's pulling out with women, I believe, was a 13 number. And that's still beneath the margin for Hillary. So we'll see if that can continue to grow. We can see a massive, massive gap here. Another thing that's important to mention, also should have mentioned this in another video and earlier, because it's a youth vote that's kind of stemming you, you're going to have to be able to really do voter registration drives because those are going to end up being really massive for your campaign. So I think Harris needs to start talking about that, and I think she's failed so far in really stressing voter registration to go with turnout and voter turnout. So that's another thing that I think she needs to stress. But what we have here is an absolutely massive boost amongst women voters in the state. There's also some, PA net voter registration change in counties since the Biden dropout. So we're seeing a lot of boosts in registration. Women voters going up in their registration. Some interesting stuff potentially happening in these Republican states as well. Always want to hear your thoughts on that, see what you think. But Kamala Harris surging with women voters. She needs to continue to build on it. You need at least Hillary numbers. Ideally, you can get higher. But I'd say the bare minimum is probably the Hillary numbers.